If she discovers the truth, silence her permanently. Those were the words I found hidden in my cowboy husband's Bible in 1885. Thomas had been secretly working with Eastern land grabbers who put a $500 bounty on my head, thinking this half-breed troublemaker would be easy prey. I'm Sarah Two Rivers McKenzie, and at 78 years old, I'm about to share the most dangerous secret I've ever kept. For 20 years, I'd been the perfect ranch wife in our Montana Valley, but that note revealed my husband was planning my murder. So I gathered every neighbor, every tribal warrior, every person they thought was powerless. When Harrison's lieutenant asked why I wasn't running scared, I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Because you just made the biggest mistake of your life." When did you discover you were stronger than you ever imagined? Share your moment in the comments, because I'm about to show you how a terrified ranch wife became the most feared woman in all of Montana Territory, and it started with one simple decision. I still remember that crisp October morning in 1885 as clearly as if it happened yesterday. The sun was just cresting over the Bitterroot Mountains, painting our Montana Valley in shades of gold and amber that reminded me of the sacred colors my Lakota grandmother used in her beadwork. But as I stepped onto our ranch house porch, something felt different. The air carried an unusual stillness, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. As was my custom, I faced east toward the rising sun and whispered the morning prayer my mother had taught me in her native tongue, Wakantanka. Thank you for this new day, for the breath in our bodies, and for the land that sustains us. But today, the words felt heavy on my tongue. My grandmother used to say that when prayers felt like stones in your mouth. The spirits were trying to warn you of danger ahead. "Mama, are you talking to the spirits again?" My daughter Mary's voice carried a hint of teasing as she joined me on the porch, her auburn hair so like my Irish father's catching the morning light. At 25, she had grown into a beautiful young woman who moved comfortably between both worlds of her heritage. "I'm giving thanks, just as your great-grandmother taught me," I replied, wrapping my arm around her shoulders. Though today, I feel like they're trying to tell me something I'm not ready to hear. Inside our warm kitchen, the familiar sounds of morning filled the air. James, my 28-year-old son, was already at the table, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. He had his father's Scottish features, but my mother's dark eyes that seemed to see more than most folks were comfortable with. "Morning, Ma," he said, looking up from the ranch ledger he'd been studying. "We've got 30 head ready to move to the south pasture today. The grass is still good down there, and it'll give the North Range time to recover before winter." Thomas appeared in the doorway, adjusting his suspenders over his flannel shirt with shaking hands. At 55, he was still a handsome man, but this morning he looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and a thin sheen of sweat beaded his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Sarah, darling," he said, his voice pitched higher than usual. "I'll need to ride into Missoula today. Urgent bank business that absolutely cannot wait another day." I set a plate of fresh biscuits and bacon before him, watching as he pushed the food around his plate like a man who'd lost his appetite entirely. When I reached to refill his coffee cup, I noticed a folded paper sticking out from his shirt pocket paper he quickly shoved deeper when he caught me looking. "Will you be back for supper?" I asked, though the way he avoided my gaze told me everything I needed to know. "Might be very late. Could be gone overnight. Actually," he finally looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes made my blood run cold, the same look a cornered animal gets right before it either runs or fights. "Don't wait up for me. And Sarah, if anyone comes asking for me while I'm gone, you tell them you don't know when I'll be back." Mary and James exchanged worried glances across the table. Our family had always shared everything openly. Thomas's secretiveness was more than unusual. It was frightening. "Pa, what kind of bank business requires?" James began. "The kind that's none of your concern," Thomas snapped, then immediately looked stricken by his own harsh tone. "I'm sorry, Son, it's just... There are some matters a man has to handle alone. As he hurried to gather his things, I noticed him slip into his study for several minutes. When he emerged, his saddlebags bulged with what looked like papers, and he kept glancing toward the window as if expecting unwelcome visitors to appear at any moment. Standing in my kitchen, watching the man I'd loved for 20 years act like a stranger preparing to flee, I heard my grandmother's voice as clearly as if she were standing beside me. Little dove. When the spirits whisper warnings, only fools refuse to listen. The spirits were screaming now, and I knew with bone-deep certainty that whatever Thomas was hiding, it was about to destroy everything we'd built together. Have you ever felt that cold dread when someone you love starts acting like a stranger? When your gut tells you something terrible is coming, but you're afraid to dig deeper because what I discovered in Thomas's study that afternoon changed everything I thought I knew about my marriage. After Thomas rode off toward Missoula, his horse kicking up dust clouds that seemed to hang in the still air longer than natural, I threw myself into the day's work with the kind of fierce determination my Lakota grandmother called keeping the darkness at bay with busy hands. We were expecting the Hendersons and the O'Malleys for Sunday dinner after church, a monthly tradition that brought together the scattered families of our valley. Doc O'Malley's wife Margaret had been feeling poorly lately, and I'd promised to share my mother's recipe for willow bark tea that eased the aching in her joints. "Mary, help me move the good china to the dining table," I called, pulling out the delicate plates that had been my wedding gift from Thomas's family back in Scotland. "And we'll need to set places for 8. The Henderson boy is back from his year at the university in Helena." As we worked together, I found myself watching Mary's graceful movements, remembering how my own mother had taught me to prepare for guests with the same careful attention to hospitality, in both the white world and the Lakota way. I told Mary as we arranged wildflowers in mason jars, "Welcoming others into your home is sacred work." "Tell me again about great-grandmother's welcoming ceremony," Mary said, her hands stilling on the flowers. Even though she'd heard the story dozens of times, she never tired of hearing about the old ways. When visitors came to her lodge, she would burn sweetgrass and offer them water first, before food, before conversation. She said that sharing water connected souls across all the barriers that divided people. I touched the small bundle of sweetgrass I kept in the kitchen drawer, a gift from my Uncle White Eagle during his last visit. "Your great-grandmother believed that a home where strangers became friends was blessed by the spirits." James appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face troubled. "Ma, I tried to check on the cattle in the north pasture like Pa asked, but I can't find the key to his study where he keeps the grazing charts. The door's locked tight, and..." He hesitated, running a hand through his dark hair. "There's a smell coming from under the door, like someone's been burning papers." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the October air. In 20 years of marriage, Thomas had never locked his study during the day. It was his private space. Yes, but not a secret one. "Maybe he was just organizing his papers before the trip," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "Ma," James said quietly, "I found something else. Boot prints around the back of the house, near Pa's study window. Fresh ones, made sometime after the morning dew settled. Someone was standing there, looking in." Before I could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew our attention to the front window. The Hendersons were arriving early, their wagon loaded with their 3 children and what looked like all their worldly possessions. "Sarah," called out Emma Henderson as she climbed down from the wagon seat, "I hope you don't mind us coming early, but we needed to talk to you and Thomas about something important." Her husband Frank helped her down, his weathered face grim with worry. "Is Thomas here? We've got news from town that affects all the ranchers in the valley." "He's in Missoula on business," I replied, stepping onto the porch with my best hostess smile firmly in place, even as my heart hammered against my ribs. "But please, come in, whatever's troubling you." We can discuss it over coffee. As I ushered our guests inside, serving coffee and fresh-baked bread while their children played with our old dog Rex in the yard, I maintained the perfect facade of the gracious ranch wife. But underneath my calm exterior, my grandmother's warnings echoed like thunder when the spirits whisper danger. Only fools refuse to listen. And with each passing hour of Thomas's absence, each locked door and burned paper and mysterious footprint, the whispers were becoming a roar I could no longer ignore. Something was terribly wrong, and I was beginning to suspect that whatever was coming for our peaceful valley, my husband was right at the center of it. Have you ever found mysterious evidence that someone you love was hiding something dangerous? Tell me your story, because what the Hendersons were about to reveal would connect all these terrifying clues in ways I never imagined. As I poured coffee for Frank Henderson, I noticed his calloused hands shaking slightly around the ceramic cup. Emma sat rigidly beside him, her usual warm smile replaced by the tight-lipped expression of someone carrying bad news. "Sarah," Frank began, his voice heavy with worry. "There's been talk in town about a new land development company. Eastern investors. They call themselves the Montana Territory Development Corporation. They've been buying up ranch properties all through the valley, offering prices that seem too good to be true." "That sounds like good fortune for folks wanting to sell," I replied carefully, though something in his tone made my stomach clench with unease. Emma leaned forward, her eyes darting toward the window as if expecting unwelcome visitors. "That's just it. Sarah, they're not asking folks if they want to sell. They're telling them they have to, claiming there are problems with land titles, issues with the original territorial grants, saying that anyone who can't prove clear ownership going back to the original surveys will have their property seized." Before I could respond, the sound of more approaching horses filled the air. Through the window, I watched as the O'Malleys arrived, followed closely by the Clearwater family and old Henrik Larson from the northern range. What should have been a pleasant Sunday gathering was turning into something that looked more like an emergency meeting. Doc O'Malley was the first through the door, his medical bag still in his hand as if he'd been pulled away from a patient. "Frank, Emma, good you're already here. We need to talk about this land business before it gets any worse." "How much worse can it get?" asked Tom Clearwater, helping his pregnant wife Marie settle into a chair. "They came to our place yesterday with papers claiming our deed isn't valid because Marie's grandmother was Blackfeet. Said mixed blood families don't have the same property rights as legitimate settlers." The words hit me like a physical blow. Marie Clearwater was only 1/4 native, her grandmother having married a French trapper decades ago. If they were targeting her family's land rights, then families like mine with my obvious Lakota heritage would be prime targets. "It's not just the mixed families," Doc O'Malley said grimly. "They're going after anyone who might have trouble fighting them in court. Widows, immigrants who don't speak perfect English, families without connections to lawyers in Helena or Butte." Henrik Larson nodded gravely. "They came to my place too. Said because I'm Norwegian, my English isn't good enough to have understood the original land contracts. 40 years I've worked that land, and they want to take it for administrative irregularities." As I listened to each family's story, a terrible pattern began to emerge. The Montana Territory Development Corporation wasn't just buying land, they were systematically targeting the most vulnerable families in our valley, using legal technicalities and racial prejudice to steal property that had been honestly earned and fairly purchased. "Has anyone seen the actual legal documents?" I asked, my mind racing. "Or met with these Eastern investors face to face?" "That's the strangest part," Frank Henderson replied. "All the paperwork comes through intermediaries, local men who claim to represent the corporation. And Sarah." He hesitated, glancing around at the other faces in my living room. "One of those intermediaries has been asking specific questions about your family, about Thomas's position at the bank, about your mixed heritage, about how much land you own." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the mantel clock. Every eye was on me, waiting for my response. But all I could hear was the roaring of blood in my ears as the pieces of a terrible puzzle began falling into place. Thomas's secretive behavior, his mysterious trip to Missoula, the locked study and burned papers, his fear that someone might come looking for him while he was away. My husband wasn't just involved in this land-grabbing scheme, he was helping to orchestrate it. And now, sitting in my own living room surrounded by neighbors who trusted me, I realized that I might be married to the man who was trying to destroy everything we'd all worked so hard to build. After our neighbors finally departed, their worried voices fading into the Montana evening, I stood alone in my kitchen with the terrible weight of suspicion pressing down on my shoulders like a winter storm. Mary and James had ridden over to the Clearwater Ranch to help Tom secure his livestock. Everyone was expecting trouble now, and frontier families knew the value of standing together. The house felt unnaturally quiet without their presence. Even Rex, our old cattle dog, seemed to sense the tension in the air and lay by the kitchen door with his ears pricked forward, listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. I knew what I had to do, though every instinct my Irish father had taught me about respecting a husband's privacy warred against what my Lakota grandmother had always said. When the safety of the tribe is threatened, even sacred boundaries must be crossed. Thomas's study door stood before me like a barrier between the woman I had been and the woman I would have to become. The brass key he usually kept on his desk was nowhere to be found, but I remembered seeing him slip something into the small drawer of the hallway table before he left that morning. My hands trembled as I searched through the drawer's contents: old letters, a broken pocket watch, and, finally, cold metal against my fingertips. The key felt heavier than it should have as I slipped it into the lock and turned. The door opened with a soft creak that seemed to echo through the empty house like a gunshot. Thomas's study had always been his sanctuary, filled with leather-bound books, banking documents, and the lingering scent of his pipe tobacco. But now, in the fading afternoon light, it felt like entering a stranger's room. Papers were scattered across his desk in a way that spoke of hasty packing. The fireplace held the charred remains of what looked like letters and documents, evidence of the paper burning James had smelled earlier. But it was the bookshelf that drew my attention, specifically the large family Bible that had belonged to Thomas's grandfather. The Bible sat askew on its shelf, as if it had been hastily replaced after being handled. My grandmother had always taught me that sacred books held their own power, that they could reveal truths when the spirits deemed it necessary. With reverent hands, I lifted the heavy leather volume from its place. As I moved toward the desk to set it down, the Bible slipped from my nervous fingers. It hit the wooden floor with a dull thud, falling open to the Book of Psalms, and from between those sacred pages, a folded piece of paper fluttered to the floor like a dying leaf. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It belonged to Colonel Harrison, the man who'd been asking questions about our family around town. The message was brief, written in the clipped military style I'd heard him use when speaking to the other ranchers. Thomas, the Two Rivers woman, is asking too many questions about the land transfers. Her mixed blood gives her connections to tribal elders who might interfere with the northern acquisitions. If she discovers the full scope of our operation before we're ready to move, she becomes a liability that must be permanently silenced. The corporation has ways of dealing with obstacles that can't be bought or intimidated. Handle this quietly, or we will handle it for you. E. The paper slipped from my numb fingers as the full horror of my situation crashed over me like an avalanche. My husband, the man I'd shared a bed with for 20 years, the father of my children, was part of a conspiracy that planned to murder me if I got too close to the truth. But I already was too close to the truth. I had asked questions. I did have connections to tribal elders through my uncle White Eagle, and I had just discovered evidence that could expose their entire operation. Standing alone in that study, holding proof of a plot against my life. I felt something shift inside me like tectonic plates moving deep in the earth. The frightened ranch wife who had entered this room was gone. In her place stood a woman who carried the blood of warriors, the wisdom of 2 cultures, and the fierce determination to protect not just her own life, but the lives of everyone in this valley. Colonel Harrison and his corporation had made a fatal mistake. They thought they were dealing with just another frontier wife who could be intimidated into silence. They were about to learn what happened when you threatened a woman who had both Irish fire and Lakota steel running through her veins. That night, as the Montana sky blazed with more stars than seemed possible, I saddled my mare Sage and rode north toward the Lakota reservation where my Uncle White Eagle lived with the remnants of our people. The October air cut through my wool coat like a blade, but the cold was nothing compared to the ice that had settled around my heart after reading that terrible note. The 15-mile ride through darkness would have been dangerous for most frontier women, but my mother had taught me to read the land by starlight, to follow the ancient trails that connected sacred places across the territory. Sage knew these paths too, her hooves finding sure footing even where the moonlight failed to penetrate the pine shadows. I reached the reservation settlement just as the first gray light of dawn touched the eastern mountains. Smoke was already rising from the cooking fires, and I could hear the soft murmur of morning prayers being offered to the four directions. Despite everything the government had done to scatter and diminish our people, the old ways persisted like underground rivers that surface when least expected. Niece. Uncle White Eagle's voice carried no surprise as he emerged from his small cabin, though I hadn't sent word of my coming. At 73, he moved with the careful dignity of a man who had seen his world change beyond recognition but refused to be broken by it. His long gray braids were woven with red cloth, and the eagle feather in his hair marked his status as a keeper of tribal wisdom. Uncle, I need the counsel of the elders, I said in the Lakota tongue that still felt like coming home after speaking English for days. There is danger to our people and to the white families who have shown us respect. He studied my face in the growing light, his dark eyes reading the fear and determination written there. Come, the council fire still burns from last night's prayers. The spirits told us someone would come seeking wisdom before the sun rose. Inside the council lodge, 4 elderly men and 2 women sat in a circle around a small fire that cast dancing shadows on the hide walls. I recognized each face, survivors of the old days when our people moved freely across these lands, now confined to this small reservation but still carrying the accumulated wisdom of generations. I told them everything, the land scheme targeting mixed heritage families, Thomas's betrayal, the death threat hidden in his Bible, Colonel Harrison's plan to steal our valley through legal manipulation and violence. I spoke in both English and Lakota, letting each language carry the parts of the story it could best express. When I finished, the eldest woman, Grandmother Hawkfeather, spoke first. This colonel seeks to divide us by using the white man's laws against those who bridge 2 worlds. But he does not understand that those who walk between worlds carry the strength of both. What would you have us do? Niece, asked Uncle White Eagle. Our young men grow restless, angry at the injustices. Some speak of taking up arms as in the old days. No, I said firmly. Violence will only give them excuse to destroy what remains of our people. But we have other weapons knowledge of the land that goes back generations. Understanding of the legal treaties they think we cannot read, and connections to white families who will stand with us if they know the truth. Grandmother Hawkfeather nodded approvingly. The spider does not defeat the eagle through strength, but by weaving a web the eagle cannot see until it is too late. What web would you weave, daughter of 2 peoples? As the sun climbed higher and the council fire burned down to glowing coals, we began to plan. The tribal elders knew which lands held sacred significance that federal law protected, even if the local authorities ignored those protections. They knew which government officials in Helena could be trusted to uphold treaty obligations. Most importantly, they knew how to gather information without arousing suspicion, a skill learned through decades of surviving in a world that wanted them to disappear. I will return to my ranch and continue playing the role of the frightened wife, I told them. But I need riders who can carry messages between the reservation and the white families being targeted. We must coordinate our response before Colonel Harrison realizes how much we know. It will be dangerous, Uncle White Eagle warned. If they discover our involvement, they will use it as excuse to take more of our land, to move us even further from our ancestors' bones. Uncle, I said, rising to face the circle of elders. They plan to take everything anyway. Our choice is not between safety and danger. It is between fighting with dignity or dying on our knees. As I prepared to ride back to the ranch, Grandmother Hawkfeather pressed a small leather pouch into my hands. "Sage and sweetgrass," she said. "Burn this when you need the spirits to guide your steps. And remember, child, sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating your enemies, but from making them defeat themselves." I returned to the ranch just as James and Mary were finishing the morning chores, their faces etched with worry that melted into relief when they saw me riding up the valley trail. Sage was lathered with sweat from our hard ride, but I felt more energized than I had in days, the strength that comes from knowing you're no longer fighting alone. "Ma, thank God," Mary said, running to help me dismount. "When we came back from the clear waters and found you gone, we feared the worst. James wanted to ride out searching, but I convinced him to wait until dawn. I had to seek counsel from your great-uncle," I replied, leading Sage toward the barn. "And what I learned changes everything. Gather in the kitchen, we need to talk, and we don't have much time." As I quickly unsaddled my mare and rubbed her down, I could hear James and Mary moving about the house, their voices low with concern. When I entered the kitchen, they were seated at the table with coffee already poured, their faces reflecting the seriousness they'd learned to read in mine. "Children," I began, using the term I'd called them since they were small, though they were now grown adults with lives of their own. "Your father is involved in something that threatens not just our family, but every ranch family in this valley. I found evidence that he's working with men who plan to steal our neighbor's land and who have decided that I know too much to be allowed to live." I showed them the note from Colonel Harrison, watching as their faces cycled through disbelief, anger, and finally, grim determination. James's hands clenched into fists as he read, while Mary's eyes filled with tears that she quickly wiped away. "What do we do?" James asked, his voice carrying the steady tone of a man ready to fight for his family. "We coordinate with our neighbors and with the tribal elders," I replied. "Uncle White Eagle is sending riders to carry messages between the reservation and the threatened families. We're going to gather evidence of the land fraud, document everything, and present it to the territorial authorities in Helena before Colonel Harrison can complete his scheme." Over the next 2 days, our kitchen became the unofficial headquarters of the valley's resistance. Frank Henderson arrived with copies of the fraudulent documents that had been served on his family. Doc O'Malley brought news from town that several businesses were being pressured to sell to mysterious Eastern investors. The Clearwater family shared information about which tribal lands were being illegally surveyed by Harrison's men. Each piece of evidence fit into the larger pattern. We were documenting a systematic attempt to seize control of the entire Bitterroot Valley through legal manipulation, intimidation, and when necessary, violence. We copied documents by lamplight, compared stories, and built an airtight case that would expose the conspiracy. It was on the third evening, as Mary and I were organizing the evidence into packets to be carried to Helena, that we heard the sound of a horse approaching at speed. James stepped onto the porch with his rifle, then called back with surprise in his voice, "Ma, it's Pa. He's riding hard, and he looks like he's seen a ghost." My blood turned to ice. Thomas wasn't supposed to return for another week. His early arrival could only mean one thing: someone had warned him that his secret was no longer safe. Through the kitchen window, I watched my husband dismount with the jerky movements of a man operating on pure panic. His clothes were disheveled, his face unshaven, and his eyes darted constantly toward the tree line as if he expected enemies to emerge from every shadow. "Sarah," he called as he burst through the door, not bothering to remove his hat or coat. "We need to talk, now." Privately, James and Mary exchanged glances, then looked to me for guidance. I could see the question in their eyes. Was this still their father? Or had he become something else entirely, a man capable of orchestrating his own wife's murder? James, Mary, I said calmly, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. Please give your father and me a few minutes alone. As my children reluctantly left the kitchen, Thomas began pacing like a caged animal, his boots clicking against the wooden floor in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown to disaster. Sarah, there are things happening that you don't understand, he began, his voice pitched high with stress. Dangerous things. I need you to pack a bag, just essentials, and come with me tonight. We're leaving Montana, and we're never coming back. I reached into my apron pocket and pulled out the folded note I'd found in his Bible, placing it on the kitchen table between us like a loaded gun. Thomas's face went white as parchment when he saw his own handwriting, and he sank into a chair as if his legs could no longer support him. So you know, he whispered, his voice barely audible above the ticking of the mantel clock. I know that Colonel Harrison wants me dead because I might interfere with your land-stealing scheme, I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the rage burning in my chest. I know that you've been helping him target families like ours, families with mixed heritage who might have trouble defending themselves in white courts. What I don't know is why the man I married 20 years ago became someone who could plan his own wife's murder. Thomas buried his face in his hands, and when he looked up, I saw tears streaming down his cheeks, the first time I'd seen him cry since his mother's funeral. Sarah, you have to understand, I never wanted any of this. It started small. Just adjusting some land records to help Eastern investors acquire properties that weren't being properly developed. Harrison convinced me it was good for the territory, bringing in capital and progress. And when did it become murder? I asked coldly. When you started asking questions about the Henderson case, Harrison said you were too smart, too connected to the tribal elders. He said mixed blood families always caused trouble because they had feet in both worlds, could rally both communities against development projects. Thomas's voice cracked. He told me that if I couldn't keep you quiet, he'd find someone who could keep you permanently silent. So you chose to save yourself instead of protecting your wife. I chose to try to get us all out alive, he exploded, jumping to his feet. Sarah, you don't understand what these men are capable of. Harrison has backing from railroad interests, mining companies, people with enough money to buy judges and sheriffs. They've done this in Colorado. In Wyoming, they take what they want, and anyone who stands in their way disappears. I heard the soft creak of floorboards in the hallway and knew that James and Mary were listening to every word. Good. They needed to hear this, needed to understand what their father had become. But something's gone wrong, hasn't it? I said, studying his panicked expression. That's why you're back early, why you want us to run? Thomas nodded miserably. One of Harrison's men was in Missoula, said there were rumors that someone was organizing the targeted families. Gathering evidence, Harrison thinks there might be a spy in his organization, someone feeding information to the resistance. He's moved up his timeline instead of waiting until spring to finalize the land seizures. He's planning to act within the week. Act how? Forced evictions. Armed men will serve papers claiming immediate forfeiture for various legal violations. Anyone who resists will be arrested or worse. And Sarah, his voice dropped to a whisper, he's put a bounty on your head. $500 to anyone who brings proof that the half-breed troublemaker has been permanently silenced. The kitchen fell silent except for the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. $500 was more money than most frontiermen saw in 2 years. There would be no shortage of volunteers willing to earn that bounty. How long do we have? I asked. Harrison's men will be here tomorrow night. He wanted to give me one last chance to handle the situation myself before he sends in the professionals. Thomas reached across the table, his hand shaking as he tried to grasp mine. Sarah, please. We can take the children and disappear into Canada. Start over somewhere he'll never find us. I looked at this man who had shared my bed and my dreams for 2 decades, who had fathered my children and built this ranch with me, and realized that I was looking at a stranger. The Thomas I had married would never have chosen his own safety over his family's honor, would never have helped outsiders steal from his neighbors. "No," I said simply. "No." His voice cracked with disbelief. "No. We're not running. Tomorrow night, when Harrison's men come for me, they're going to find that this half-breed troublemaker has some surprises waiting for them." From the hallway, I heard James's voice, strong and determined. "And they'll find that she's not alone." The time for hiding and planning was over. Tomorrow night, we would discover whether the web we'd woven was strong enough to catch the predators who thought they could devour our valley. As word spread through our network of riders and signals, the ranch transformed into something I'd never seen before, a fortress where 2 cultures stood united against a common enemy. By midnight, our yard was filled with horses, wagons, and the quiet voices of neighbors who had chosen to risk everything rather than surrender to Harrison's scheme. Frank Henderson arrived with his 3 grown sons, all carrying rifles and grim determination. Doc O'Malley came with his medical bag and a shotgun, ready to tend wounds or deal them out as needed. The Clearwater family brought not only themselves, but also Marie's Blackfeet cousins from the northern reservation, silent men who moved like shadows and whose presence added a dangerous edge to our gathering. But it was the arrival of Uncle White Eagle and 12 Lakota warriors that truly changed the atmosphere. They rode in just before dawn, their horses' hooves muffled by cloth wrappings, their faces painted with the traditional symbols of men prepared for battle. These were not the defeated reservation Indians that Harrison expected to deal with. These were the descendants of warriors who had fought Custer at Little Bighorn, and their eyes burned with the fire of men defending their people's survival. "Niece," Uncle White Eagle said as he dismounted, his war paint making him look decades younger. "The spirits have spoken. This fight is not just about your life or even about our lands. This is about whether people who walk between worlds will be allowed to exist, or whether men like Harrison will succeed in dividing us until we can all be conquered separately." Thomas stood apart from the gathering, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. Several times I saw him start toward his horse as if he might still flee. But each time he stopped, his gaze moving between our children and the armed men filling our yard. "Pa?" James said quietly. Approaching his father with a rifle in his hands, "You can still choose which side of this fight you want to be on." "I don't know how to fight men like Harrison," Thomas replied, his voice hollow with defeat. "I'm just a banker who got in over his head." "Then don't fight like a banker," Mary said, stepping up beside her brother. "Fight like a father whose family is threatened. Fight like a man whose neighbors trusted him to do what's right." As the sun climbed higher, we prepared our trap with the methodical precision of people who knew their lives depended on getting every detail right. The tribal warriors positioned themselves in the tree line surrounding the ranch, invisible to anyone approaching from the valley road. Our white neighbors took positions in the barn and outbuildings, creating crossfire zones that would make any assault on the house a deadly mistake. Doc O'Malley and I prepared the house itself, moving furniture to create defensive positions and gathering medical supplies in the kitchen where they'd be easily accessible. The evidence we'd compiled, all the documents proving Harrison's conspiracy, was hidden in multiple locations, with copies already on their way to Helena via trusted writers. "Sarah," Uncle White Eagle said as we made our final preparations, "there is something you must understand. Tonight, when Harrison's men come, they will not expect to find Lakota warriors waiting for them. This will frighten them more than any number of white settlers with guns. Because they know we fight differently. We fight to protect our people's future, not just our own lives." As the afternoon shadows grew longer, Thomas finally made his choice. He approached me as I was checking the loads in my rifle, the same weapon my father had taught me to use when I was Mary's age. "Sarah," he said, his voice steadier than it had been since his return, "I can't undo what I've done. But I can make sure Harrison doesn't get the chance to hurt you or anyone else in this valley." "What are you thinking?" I asked, though something in his expression made my heart clench with sudden fear. "Harrison trusts me. If I ride out to meet his men before they reach the ranch, I can convince them that you've fled, that the house is empty except for me. Lead them into the trap without them realizing what's waiting." It was a dangerous plan, one that would put Thomas directly in harm's way. But it was also the kind of sacrifice that might redeem 20 years of marriage that had ended in betrayal and lies. "If you do this," I said quietly, "there's no going back. Harrison will know you've chosen sides." "I chose my side 20 years ago when I married you," he replied. "It just took me too long to remember that." As the sun set behind the Bitterroot Mountains, casting our valley in shades of gold and crimson, we took our positions and waited for the sound of approaching hoofbeats that would signal the beginning of the most important fight of our lives. The sound came just as the last light faded from the western sky, the steady rhythm of multiple horses moving at a purposeful pace up our valley road. From my position behind the kitchen window, I counted the shadows, 8 riders, just as Thomas had predicted. Colonel Harrison had brought enough men to handle what he thought would be a simple execution, but not enough to deal with the army of defenders waiting in the darkness. Thomas rode out to meet them at the gate, his silhouette recognizable even in the dim starlight. I watched him gesture toward the house, heard his voice carrying across the still air as he spoke to Harrison lies about how I had fled in panic, how the house stood empty except for him, how the half-breed troublemaker had finally shown her cowardice by running to Canada. "Excellent work, Thomas." Harrison's voice carried clearly in the night air, filled with the satisfaction of a man who believed victory was within his grasp. "Though I confess, I'm disappointed not to collect that bounty personally. Still, with her gone, the rest of these mixed-blood families will fall in line quickly enough. The children are inside, packing the last of their things." Thomas continued, each lie drawing the riders closer to our carefully prepared killing ground. "They'll be gone by morning, and you'll have no further trouble from this family." As the group approached the house, I could see Harrison clearly for the first time, a tall, lean man with a military bearing and cold eyes that reflected no warmth even in the lamplight spilling from our windows. The men with him were clearly professional gunfighters, not local ranch hands pressed into service. Their weapons were well maintained, their movements coordinated, their eyes constantly scanning for threats they never suspected were already surrounding them. "Light the lamps." "Thomas," Harrison ordered as they reached the porch, "I want to see for myself that the house is truly empty. Can't have any witnesses to report that we were here tonight." That was the signal we'd been waiting for. As Thomas struck a match and held it to the porch lantern, the flame served as our agreed-upon sign that the trap was ready to spring. The first shot came from James, positioned in the barn loft with a clear view of the yard. His bullet took down Harrison's lieutenant before the man could even draw his weapon. The night exploded into chaos as our defenders opened fire from positions Harrison's men had never suspected existed. But it was the war cries of the Lakota warriors that truly shattered the bounty hunter's composure. Uncle White Eagle's voice rose above the gunfire in the ancient battle cry of our people. And suddenly the darkness came alive with painted figures who seemed to materialize from the very earth itself. "Indians!" one of Harrison's men screamed, his voice cracking with terror. "It's a trap. We're surrounded by savages." The irony wasn't lost on me. These men who had planned to murder an innocent woman were calling my uncle's warriors savages, while bullets flew around them in the night. Harrison himself proved to be a coward when faced with real resistance. Instead of rallying his men, he spurred his horse toward the road, abandoning his hired guns to face the consequences of their greed alone. But he hadn't counted on Marie Clearwater's Blackfeet cousins, who had positioned themselves precisely to cut off any retreat. The battle lasted less than 10 minutes. When the smoke cleared and the gunfire ceased, 5 of Harrison's men lay dead in our yard. 2 more were wounded and captured, and Harrison himself sat bound and gagged, his military arrogance replaced by the wide-eyed fear of a man who finally understood that his victims had refused to remain victims. Thomas emerged from the chaos unharmed, though I could see in his eyes that something fundamental had changed in him during those violent minutes. He had chosen his side at last, and the choice had cost him any possibility of returning to his old life. "It's over," he said simply, holstering the smoking pistol he'd used to defend our home. But even as he spoke those words, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October night air. Harrison, despite his bonds, was smiling a cold, knowing expression that made my blood freeze. "You think killing me ends this?" he said, his voice carrying despite the gag we'd loosened to question him. "I'm just one man, Mrs. McKenzie. The Montana Territory Development Corporation has investors in New York, Chicago, Washington, men with more money and power than you can imagine." Uncle White Eagle stepped forward, his war paint making him look like an ancient spirit of vengeance. "Then they will learn what happened to their representative, and they will think twice about sending others." Harrison's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. "They'll learn that a half-breed woman and a handful of reservation Indians killed white men in Montana Territory. Do you have any idea what kind of federal response that will bring down on your heads?" The words hit me like physical blows. In our moment of victory, we had forgotten the larger political reality. The government was already looking for excuses to further restrict tribal rights, to seize more reservation land. A battle that involved native warriors killing white men, even criminal white men, could provide exactly the justification they needed. "The territorial governor will have federal troops here within a week," Harrison continued, his smile growing wider as he saw understanding dawn in our faces. "And when they arrive, they won't be interested in your evidence or your explanations. They'll see dead white men and armed Indians, and they'll do what the government always does. They'll make the problem disappear." Standing in my yard, surrounded by the bodies of our enemies, I realized that our victory might have just signed the death warrant for every Native American family in the territory. We had won the battle, but in doing so, we might have lost a much larger war. The spirits had whispered warnings about immediate danger, but they had been silent about the storm that our own actions might unleash. As Harrison's words echoed like a curse, I watched triumph transform into horror on every face around me. Uncle White Eagle's painted features tightened with the knowledge of a man who had seen victories become disasters for his people. Our white neighbors shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware that their association with armed Indians could destroy their families' futures. "Everyone inside," I said quietly, my mind racing. "We counsel together before anyone makes decisions they'll regret." Within minutes, our kitchen filled with the same people who had just risked their lives together. But Harrison's warning had driven a wedge between allies who moments before had been united. "Sarah," Frank Henderson said reluctantly, "you know we're grateful for what your uncle's warriors did. But if federal troops come looking for Indian raiders who killed white men, you'll deny we were ever here." Uncle White Eagle finished, his tone carrying weary acceptance of broken promises. "No," I said firmly, standing where Thomas and I had shared thousands of meals. "We're not letting Harrison divide us in death, but we'll be smarter about handling this." I looked out at the bodies scattered in our yard, evidence that could bring government wrath down on innocent people. Harrison made one crucial mistake. He assumed that because I have Lakota blood, I don't understand white law. But I've spent 20 years listening to banking discussions about territorial regulations and legal precedents. Thomas looked up from his coffee, showing his first spark of hope since Harrison's threats. "What are you thinking? Harrison and his men came as criminals, not legitimate authority. They came to commit murder for money bounty hunters operating outside law. Under territorial statute, property owners have the right to defend themselves against criminal trespass with deadly force." Doc O'Malley leaned forward. "You're framing this as defensive action by property owners, not an Indian raid." "Exactly. The warriors here weren't raiders, they were invited guests helping neighbors defend property against criminal assault. No different than hired security guards. except more effective. Uncle White Eagle smiled slightly. And the war paint? Battle cries will authorities overlook obvious tribal involvement? They will if we give them compelling reason, I replied, pulling out our evidence. We have documented proof of Harrison's conspiracy, his illegal land-grabbing scheme, testimony from targeted families. Present this properly, and Harrison becomes the villain, not the victim. Over the next hour, we crafted a narrative both truthful and strategic. The criminal conspiracy would be exposed fully, with Harrison portrayed as leader of armed criminals who died attempting to murder innocent settlers. Tribal warriors would be described as local security volunteers with night-fighting expertise, common arrangements where survival depended on cooperation between groups. As dawn broke over the Bitterroot Mountains, we had transformed potential disaster into foundation for something unprecedented, a truly integrated frontier community where settlers and Native Americans worked as equals, bound by mutual respect and shared commitment to justice. Thomas approached where I organized evidence packets. Sarah, I don't know if I can ever fully make up for what I did, but I want to spend whatever time I have left helping build what we started tonight. Looking at this man who had betrayed everything but found courage to choose redemption when it mattered most. I realized some healing takes more than one night to complete. But sometimes, one night is enough to plant seeds of something entirely new. 3 days after the battle, Territorial Marshal William Crawford arrived from Helena with a small company of federal investigators. I watched from our porch as they surveyed the scene, 8 graves hastily dug behind the barn, the evidence we'd carefully arranged, and a community that stood united despite the magnitude of what had occurred. Mrs. McKenzie, Marshal Crawford said, removing his hat as he approached. We've received reports of a significant incident involving criminal conspiracy and armed resistance. I understand you have evidence to present. For the next 6 hours, we laid out Harrison's entire scheme with methodical precision. Bank records Thomas provided showed the systematic theft of territorial development funds. Land office documents revealed fraudulent title transfers. Testimony from every targeted family painted a clear picture of organized criminal activity designed to steal property through legal manipulation and intimidation. Most damning of all, I said, presenting Harrison's own correspondence, are these letters detailing the conspiracy's scope and methods, including explicit orders to eliminate anyone who discovered their operations. Marshal Crawford examined each document carefully, his weathered face growing grimmer with every revelation. Mrs. McKenzie? This evidence suggests criminal activity extending far beyond Montana territory. These eastern investors you've identified have similar operations in Colorado and Wyoming. Then our actions here may have prevented similar crimes elsewhere, Uncle White Eagle observed, his dignity commanding respect even from federal officials who rarely treated Native Americans as equals. Indeed, the marshal replied, surprising everyone by addressing my uncle directly. Your cooperation in this matter has served territorial interests well. The federal government appreciates when different communities work together to uphold law and order. By week's end, our story had spread throughout Montana territory and beyond. Newspapers in Helena, Butte, and even Denver reported on the Bitterroot Valley conspiracy and how an integrated community of settlers and Native Americans had exposed and defeated a major criminal organization. Instead of the federal retaliation Harrison had threatened, we received official commendation for our service to territorial justice. The vindication brought unexpected changes. Families from across the territory began seeking land in our valley, drawn by stories of successful cooperation between different cultures. The reservation boundaries, instead of becoming barriers, became bridges as tribal members and settlers established trading relationships, shared agricultural techniques, and built mutual defense agreements. Thomas threw himself into rebuilding not just our marriage, but our community's prosperity. He used his banking knowledge to establish a territorial credit union that served both reservation and settler families equally, ensuring that future land purchases would be legitimate and protected from outside manipulation. Sarah, he said one evening as we watched James teaching Lakota horsemanship techniques to Henderson's youngest son. I spent so many years thinking I had to choose between profit and principle. I never realized that the greatest prosperity comes from communities built on trust. Mary opened a school that taught both English and Lakota languages, while Uncle White Eagle established a council where tribal elders and settler leaders could address disputes before they became conflicts. Our valley became a model for what the frontier could be when people chose cooperation over conquest. Standing on our porch 5 years later, watching my grandchildren play games that blended traditions from both cultures, I often thought about that threatening note hidden in Thomas's Bible. What was meant to destroy me had instead created something unprecedented, a community where the wisdom of two worlds had combined to build something stronger than either could achieve alone. The spirits had whispered warnings of danger, but they had also whispered promises of transformation. Sometimes the greatest threats become the catalysts for the most beautiful changes. Now, as I sit on this same porch at 78, watching the sun set behind mountains that have witnessed so much change, I marvel at what grew from that terrible night when I found Thomas's threatening note. Our Bitterroot Valley has become something none of us could have imagined, a place where the old divisions between peoples have given way to something entirely new. James serves as our territorial representative, carrying our valley's model of cooperation to the state capitol. His speeches about integrated communities have inspired similar experiments across the West. Mary's school now trains teachers who spread bilingual education throughout Montana, while her own children speak 3 languages fluently and see no contradiction in honoring both their Lakota and Irish heritage. Thomas lived to see our 25th wedding anniversary, spending his final years as a respected elder who counseled young couples about the importance of choosing principle over profit. His transformation from conspirator to community builder became legendary, proof that redemption remains possible even after the gravest betrayals. Uncle White Eagle passed 2 winters ago, but not before seeing his great-grandchildren graduate from universities in Helena and Denver, carrying forward the wisdom of both worlds. His final words to me were, "Niece, you have shown that the strength of the spider's web lies not in any single strand, but in how each thread supports all the others." Visitors come regularly now, government officials, newspaper reporters, families seeking to establish similar communities elsewhere. They ask how we achieved what so many thought impossible: genuine equality between peoples who had been taught to see each other as enemies. The answer always comes back to that night when we faced a choice between division and unity, between fear and courage. When Harrison's men rode into our valley expecting to find isolated, vulnerable targets, they instead discovered a community that had learned to weave individual strengths into collective power. Our success has spread far beyond Montana. Communities in Wyoming, Colorado, and Dakota Territory have adopted our model of integrated councils, shared schools, and mutual defense agreements. The federal government, initially suspicious of our irregular arrangements, now points to our valley as proof that peaceful coexistence between cultures can serve national interests better than forced assimilation or continued conflict. But perhaps the greatest measure of our success lies in watching my grandchildren play in the yard where bullets once flew. They create games that blend traditions from multiple cultures, speak languages their great-grandparents thought could never coexist, and see diversity as strength rather than threat. Last week, my granddaughter Emma, named for Emma Henderson, who stood with us that crucial night, asked me why some places still struggle with conflicts between different peoples when the solution seems so obvious to her generation. "Because, little one," I told her, "it takes great courage to choose unity over division, especially when that choice requires us to change how we see ourselves and others. But once people discover that they're stronger together than apart, that wisdom spreads like wildflowers after spring rain. As darkness settles over our peaceful valley, I offer the same prayer my grandmother taught me, adding words of gratitude for the unexpected blessings that can emerge from our darkest moments. Sometimes what threatens to destroy us becomes the foundation for something more beautiful than we ever dared imagine." The spirits whispered warnings that saved my life, but they also whispered promises of transformation that changed our world. My dear friends, As I reach the end of this story that has shaped not just my life, but the lives of countless others, I want you to understand something important. The woman who trembled while reading that threatening note in 1885 never imagined she possessed the strength to transform fear into courage, betrayal into redemption, and division into unity. When I found those terrible words hidden in Thomas's Bible, "If she discovers the truth, silence her permanently," I thought my world was ending. I couldn't have been more wrong. It was just beginning. The journey from that terrifying moment to the peaceful valley I see today wasn't accomplished through any special wisdom or extraordinary courage I possessed. It happened because I learned to listen to the spirits my grandmother said would guide me, to the neighbors who needed someone to stand with them, and to the quiet voice inside that whispered there had to be a better way than violence and hatred. Every step of our transformation required choosing the harder path. It would have been easier to flee when Thomas offered escape to Canada. Simpler to let fear divide our community when Harrison threatened federal retaliation. More comfortable to maintain the old boundaries between settler and native rather than risk creating something entirely new. But I learned something my grandmother had tried to teach me years before: the greatest strength comes not from standing alone, but from weaving individual threads into something larger and more beautiful than any single strand could ever be. Today, when I watch my great-grandchildren play games that blend traditions from multiple cultures, when I see young people who speak 3 languages and consider that normal rather than remarkable, when I witness communities across the West adopting our model of cooperation over conquest, I know that the seeds we planted in darkness have grown into something magnificent. The threats we faced in Montana Territory may seem distant to you now, but the choice between unity and division remains as relevant today as it was in 1885. In every community, in every family, in every human heart, we still face moments when we must decide whether to build bridges or walls, whether to choose understanding or fear, whether to stand together or fall separately. I've lived long enough to see that the problems we thought were unique to our time and place — prejudice, greed, the abuse of power, the targeting of those who seem different or vulnerable — these challenges appear in every generation. But I've also seen that the solutions we discovered — courage, community, the willingness to see strength in diversity rather than threat — these answers remain just as powerful today. So when you face your own threatening notes, your own moments when everything seems lost and the future appears impossible, remember this old woman's story. Remember that the darkest moments often come just before the greatest transformations. Remember that you possess more strength than you know, especially when you stop trying to face your challenges alone. The spirits whispered to me across more than a century to tell you this: whatever storm you're weathering, whatever betrayal you're healing from, whatever seemingly impossible bridge you're trying to build between divided peoples or divided hearts, you have everything you need within you to not just survive, but to create something beautiful from the wreckage. The sun sets behind these Montana mountains every evening, but it always rises again. And so will you.